Oh.
Right. Brilliant. So we will wait for people to join us, but hopefully we'll get cracking in a minute or so. It's always nice just seeing the numbers go up a bit. Otherwise you sort of think, oh, it'll just be the four of us then. But yeah, we'll be waiting for those lovely numbers to go up for a second. Welcome everybody. Get yourself sorted. Hope you've got a cup of tea or coffee or other non-alcoholic beverage at this time of day. Thank you, Vivi. And we'll do the intros and get started in just a moment. We'll just let people get themselves into place because it is still early in the morning in terms of the busy day ahead, I'm sure. Thank you for joining us. Good morning to those of you who are joining. Hello to people who know me. That's really sweet. I always love seeing names I haven't seen for ages. Hello. I think probably from up somewhere north, if I dare say that. I think possibly York. Okay, so I think we're getting there. A few more people just joined. Right, I always know. No, you never know. You sort of think, you sort of think, oh, I'll make a start, and then there's another little flurry. But I think what I'll do is I'll start with the housekeeping as we're getting going, and then we'll be, basically we'll just get cracking. So welcome to all of you for joining us this morning. It's lovely to see people arriving. We're just going to give you a couple of bits of housekeeping. So, for example, you will probably be best using Speaker View, keeping things nice and simple. You're all muted, so you can't suddenly unmute yourself or anything like that. But if there are questions, the best thing is to pop them in the chat. And then at the end, we'll be going through questions, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can as possible. But of course, if we don't get to all your questions, we will try and answer them after the event. So we might ask our speakers to do a quick sort of summary of anything that we didn't cover. I'm hoping we'll get through most of it. I always think it's useful, I'm still old school, to have a pen and paper to hand or something to note down any of those kind of really useful ideas or resources. If there are some useful, ideas there you want to make a note of straight away. Again, you'll get an email after the webinar, but it's just helpful to make a note at the time. If you've got problems with your tech or anything like that, just put it in the chat. I think the TriggerHub team are right behind us, as it were, so they'll be able to deal with that. And we're going to go for about an hour. I've got my timer set, so I don't try not to overrun. I like to run these things on time. We're recording, so the recording will be available afterwards. And I just think it's important to mention, we will, as always, when I do these things, be talking about difficult topics, even mentioning things like self-harm, suicide. So I'm just saying that now so that if that's a difficult topic for you, completely understand if you need to drop out for a minute or come back later, or just watch it later when you're better prepared. So we always like to mention that, but it's fine to take a break. Okay, so our numbers have gone up a little bit more. So I think what we'll do is we'll make a start with the actual kind of main bits, the main course of the webinar, by introducing my lovely speakers today. So I'll do the intros and try not to cough too much. So Vivi Friedgut, I'm very pleased to see you today, Vivi, and I will just say a little bit about you to everybody who's joining us. So Vivi is the founder and CEO of Blackbullion, the financial wellbeing platform that's equipping young people with money skills for life and improving access to funds. Now, Blackbullion's award-winning platform can be accessed for free by over 1.2 million students at partner universities, colleges, and other organisations worldwide. It's embedded into student support departments to help with funds distribution and provide financial education. And Blackbullion gives students the skills and confidence they need to create a money smart future. And I think maybe most impressively of all, Vivi was recently named one of FinTech magazine's top 100 women. And her second book, Stay Financially Healthy, was published last year. So very, very welcome. Thank you, Vivi, for being with us today. George Mycock is a PhD candidate at the University of Worcester. He's studying muscularity oriented psychosocial issues in men. He's also a Durham University graduate and Loughborough University graduate, so very highly qualified, all in sports, exercise, physical activity, nutrition, as well as being a sports and exercise coach himself. George also has lived experience of eating disorders and poor mental health from a young age, which that experience created an interest in athlete and exerciser mental health, which led to the creation of MyoMinds, a platform where exercisers can share their story. And I know, George, you've been on lots of media and conferences talking about the subjects of muscularity-oriented psychosocial issues, exercise addiction, and eating disorders. So we're really glad to have your expertise here today. Thank you both for joining us. So what we'll do is we'll start talking a little bit, first of all, to what I like to do is just set the scene. Let's get some idea of the context at the moment of what is happening when we look at, you know, essentially money and finance and mental health for students. How do they interact with each other? You know, how does one affect the other, and so on? And what do we know about it so far? Because what we can certainly see is that there's been a significant increase in the sort of managing money stress from students, and they're juggling paid employment and their studies, and they're having time management issues, and, you know, struggling to keep up with their studies. So we know all of that is happening in the background with this cost of living crisis. So it'd be really helpful, perhaps if I go to you first, Vivi, to give us a sense of the evidence. What do we know from the research, really, really up-to-date and recent research? So I'll hand over to you to sort of say a little bit about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Dom, and an absolute pleasure to be here. It's such an important topic, and I'm just delighted that we're now having the kind of conversations that we should have been having really for the last few years. But I'm thrilled that we're here. So what I think has been most striking for us, we released a major research piece that we've been doing for the last 3 years on student money and well-being. And what's been, I think, shocking to us isn't that things are tough for students, because we know that they're tough for students, but that they're even tougher than they were during COVID, that they're even tougher than they were during lockdown, which was objectively we hope, fingers crossed, once in a generation, once in a century event, whereas financial crises come and go. This is my 4th recession, even if we're not calling it a recession. I'm an economist by trade. It annoys me that we're not calling it a recession, even though it feels like it. But financial crises come and go, whereas the pandemic was an unusual and crazy reaction. And yet, during the COVID crisis, 75% of students said they worried about money, and that number is now almost 90. And so there's been this huge leap in just general concern. And of course, what happens when you're worried about money is your mental health is impacted, your sleep is impacted, your attainment is impacted. And those things being impacted often will make money even more difficult, because we have a complicated relationship with our finances. And so when we're sad or we're depressed or we're lonely or we're upset, we'll spend more money, or we might gamble to try and catch things up, or we might lend money to a friend who's in difficulty, or what we are seeing in the report, and the report is 47 pages long, so we'll just pull out some of the highlights and people can download it later. But for example, our young people are worried about asking for help from their families because they're concerned about their families struggling. So the word sacrifice and I don't want my parents to struggle, so I'm not going to ask for any help, kept coming up. And so 23% of students, so nearly 1 in 4 students, don't want to ask for support because they don't want to make other people financially concerned. And so our young people are not only carrying their own burdens, but they are carrying, for better or worse, the burdens of their friends and of their family and of their parents and guardians. And as a consequence, we're seeing heating and eating, which unfortunately has become such a cliche now. We're seeing that genuinely play out on university campuses. And that's a huge concern. If people can't stay warm, they get sick. And if you can't eat properly, then you can't look after your physical or your mental health. And that's kind of at a headline level, that those are the things that we're really concerned about.
Thank you. Are you able to to share any individuals, obviously anonymized, like stories or vignettes that you've heard, you know, that side of it from students brings it alive, I think, for those of us who are out there. I mean, I'm sure all of us are hearing some of it ourselves, but it would be really interesting if you've got any that stand out for you, just to illustrate how difficult things are for them right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard, Dom. So when we did the survey, we also sent around a question to students just saying, you know, if you could tell somebody in power your story, what would you say to them? And we had 700 responses in 2 days, just to give you an idea of just how much these young people don't feel like they're being heard. So some of the stories we've heard, and I'm reading this directly from the quote, is things like this. I often have to skip meals. Sometimes I can only afford to eat once a day and it's cold food. I feel hungry all the time, but just if I think about spending money on food makes me nervous, because then it means I won't be able to pay my rent. I can't socialize. I've been left really lonely because I don't want to spend money on going out. And so I haven't made many friends and I can't see the friends that I have. My diet is monotonous and bland. I don't spend money on anything like clothes or essentials. I'm working 2 part-time jobs alongside studying my degree full-time. And I'm always feeling stressed, sleepless nights, constant stress, and I just can't focus. And it's things like that are just heartbreaking when you read them we didn't ask ages, but the bulk of our respondents were 18 to 21. So these are young people, and that is absolutely representative of the over 700 responses that we got. So not eating, not socializing, not going out, forget university experience. Like, the university experience has to be completely redefined for these young people. And universities are doing their very, very level best, most of them, and I really do commend them for that. But this is a problem that needs much more consolidated action, which I know we're going to get to.
Sure. I mean, for me, you know, when we think of it, that cliche of it's the best years of your life. I mean, we all know actually in life, it probably, you know, there are many good years, but that really is just heartbreaking. I find that really hard to hear. I know we're going to talk more in depth about the mental health aspects in a minute, but George, can I just get your initial thoughts just broadly about, you know, does that chime with what you're hearing with your, you know, connections and contacts, because you're a student at the moment and, you know, you're very connected in that world. I know we'll go more into depth later about mental health itself.
Yeah, and again, thanks for having me on. And it's really sad to hear those stats. I think I read through the report, but even hearing them out loud, it was quite kind of heartbreaking, and I think you could maybe see it in my facial reactions with how sad it was. Yeah, I think from my personal reflections, I think I'm really, at least in the PhD cohort, I'm really lucky that I'm on a studentship and I get a stipend. But I think most people are aware that PhD student stipends are very small, and me and my partner have been ill the last week or so, and we've noticed that we've been scared to put the heating on and scared to do these things because, yeah, I'm currently I've got a pair of gloves that I bought purely because my hands keep getting cold when I'm in the house. But I know in conversations that I've had with my fellow PhD students who don't have the stipend that I have, we occasionally have lectures in the university, and people are complaining and kind of scared of the fact that they have to pay for travel and these different aspects. And, you know, there's just weird techniques that you come up with to try and stay warm, and weird kind of ways of trying to save money. And yeah, I think the fact that you have to think in these kind of out of the box ways shows what kind of situation we're in. And again, I feel so lucky where I'm at. So yeah, and it's even a struggle for me. So yeah, it's kind of scary stuff.
It's just so sad, isn't it? And I think, you know, just to perhaps add, you know, a broader context still, because obviously, you know, Vivi and her team, the Blackbullion team, do this amazing report. But when you also see that the Student Minds report, which was a survey of about 2,000 students, I've picked out some of the sort of big headlines for me here, but when they were asked how concerned students, you know, how they were about the current cost of living situation. So 83% of them were very or quite concerned. When you think about, they're asked how it's affecting their well-being currently, very or negatively, that was 60%. And then when they were asked, you know, what are the things that you might have to do or that you have done or are likely to need to do, you know, it ties in with what Vivi was saying about asking people for support report, they don't want to, but they either have done or are likely to ask them for support in about 60% of cases, because they just feel so trapped. They've got no other options. 22% of them using food banks, 58% cutting back on eating. And, you know, for me, it's the things like the work, the impact of doing all this part-time work, you know, 76% taking on extra employment, but the impact that has on what they're supposed to be doing at university is just, you know, for me, it's just so stressful to think about for them. And then there was that thing that we talked about briefly, you mentioned at the beginning, the risk taking, Vivi, the fact that once you get into difficulty, it actually becomes this vicious cycle, doesn't it? You take more risks because you sort of feel like, well, what else can I do? And that again is laid out in black and white in the Student Minds report, where 30% had bought stuff with credit that they cannot afford, which is well up from the previous years, because, you know, and they can't afford to pay their energy bills, they can't afford the commuting costs. Those are all outlined there. So I think we'll talk a bit more later about, you know, what we can do, what universities can do, try to come up with some sort of positive ideas, because this is, you know, this is a really hard topic, and you know, something that is really quite, you know, emotive to talk about as well. But I think hopefully with those facts and figures, we've set out the scene a little bit. We've thought about, you know, what's going on. The figures are significant and up on previous years. It's the same when you look at the BBC published something last week about the Sutton Trust, you know, publishing very, very similar sort of facts and figures. This is a quick mention actually for a fantastic petition that's out there at the moment, that the people called Save the Student have done a great petition to increase student loans to match inflation. And it's a really sort of practical and sensible petition. So if you want to do one thing that is should we say, you know, positive and helpful and immediate, I would recommend signing that petition. I think you just go to sts.ac.uk and you'll find their petition, but it's the Save the Student people doing that. And I sort of feel like, you know, at this time when I hear all this, I'm like, what can I do? You know, you just want to take them a box of food, but of course there are millions of them. So, you know, Save the Students petition, I think is a positive thing to do. Right. Okay. So we've talked about the tricky sort of background figures. I personally find that all of that really, you know, quite difficult to hear about. We are going to now just cover mental health and money, which is not in itself an easy topic, but I'm hoping that, as I always try to do in all the webinars that I do, you know, come up with positive things at the end. So if you are feeling this is quite sad, we're hoping at the end we come up with some positive stuff. Okay, so the first thing that I think is helpful to do is to think about money and mental health, and that again, that sort of vicious cycle. I think Vivi, you and I have talked about this before on other webinars. Do you want to just say a little bit about that vicious cycle, just lay it out again for us, and then we'll talk a bit about individual specific mental health topics?
Of course, and I would echo your urges around the Save the Student survey. My concern is that government's not coming to save anyone, but I think adding that pressure, I think, is important. And today's budget is going to have so many additional things for older people. I think we need to remember that young people need the support that government has been not giving now for 3 or 4 years. So I would echo those calls. In terms of the cycle of mental health, we were one of the first companies to kind of really make the point that these two things are interconnected in a way that cannot be broken. And the cycle, as you say, and again, bearing in mind, I'm the economist, you're the doctor, from my side, what we see is that people have some sort of trigger with their mental health, or they are already struggling a little bit with their mental health. And what tends to happen is, because money is both a stressor but also a balm, because when we spend money, we feel good. We get that dopamine hit. That's why we spend, and it's why people want us to spend. What happens is, if we're feeling depressed or lonely or can't sleep, which is a really big one that we hear from students, that they spend when they can't sleep. So if you're not sleeping, if you're having insomnia, if you're procrastinating from doing any kind of studying, all of these different elements will often lead you towards making a quick purchase to get that to feel better. And whether that's getting a takeaway, or whether that's, you know, going onto Shane or going onto ASOS or whatever it is, you'll spend that money, you'll feel a little bit better, and then the package comes and you feel better about it, and then the bill comes and you feel worse about it, and then that becomes the cycle. I heard a really interesting story from a student recently. I do a lot of student webinars for free to any student, and I take a lot of questions. And I kind of made this throwaway comment because I've never understood why people use buy now, pay later to get takeaways. It's a big thing now. You will have seen it on the trains. Klarna, you can Klarna your Deliveroo. And my thing has always been, if you're using Klarna to buy a 10-pound pizza, you can't afford the pizza. Like, you got to do something else. And the student said the most interesting thing to me. He said to me, I was really low and I was hungry, and Deliveroo means the Klarna means that I can spread the cost of that pizza over 3 months. Whereas if I go to the supermarket, I don't have the same facility. So it's cheaper from a cash flow perspective to buy now, pay later the pizza than to go to the supermarket and buy the same ingredients for the same 10 pounds, because you can't split the costs. And I thought that was, I mean, it's an insight. It makes sense. It's logical when you hear it and you go, okay, actually that makes sense why they're doing it. But why? Because he was feeling low, because he was too cold to study. And so he was feeling low. And so having a delivery made all the difference. And that's where I think the mental health and the money kind of so intimately fits in. So you're depressed, you're upset, you're lonely, which is a huge issue because you're not able to go out and socialize, because socializing costs money. Although it doesn't have to, but that does tend to be the, you know, that does tend to be the default. So I can't see my friends. I'm feeling lonely. I'm isolated. I need to study. I can't concentrate. Everything is cold. I'm feeling really depressed. I'm going to buy something, or I'm going to, as you said, I'm going to gamble. I'm going to buy cryptocurrency. I'm going to invest in, you know, a stock tip I got, you know, from a friend's, you know, sister's boyfriend. And that will then tend to put you into the cycle where now you feel stupid because you've spent money that you know that you didn't have, and you can't ask for help. And so then you try to recoup. Sorry, I'm using a lot of air quotes, but because I don't want to use bad language, but like, you try to recoup that money, and then you take on more and more and more and increasingly risky behavior. And not to go too far down the path, but we are seeing distinct differences between male and female students in this. And in our survey, we ask people how they identify now. So I'm using it based on identification, but women tend to be taking more risky behavior with their bodies, and men tend to be taking more risky behavior with their money. So they're more likely to go into crypto. They're more likely to, you know, do those kinds of things. And so the mental health and the money absolutely simply cannot be separated, and pretending like they can is really dangerous and is putting us down a bad path. So I'm glad that we're back having a conversation.
No, it's such an important conversation because, you know, we can forget just how much of an impact money worries have. We might think, well, they're young, they'll kind of think, well, I'll make it up in the future, or I'll just get on with it now. But actually, if 80% of them, the student minds, so 80% of them are cutting back on things they enjoy, you know, hanging out with friends, stuff like that, then that has a devastating impact on becoming more isolated. You become more isolated, you become more down, depressed, anxious, and so on. Your stress levels go up. You know, we need to do stuff to have fun. We're human. We need to see other humans. And I find it, you know, that it's such a sort of this sad, vicious cycle. And then, of course, as you say, you know, the impact is that you try and do things to lift yourself, and then spending money, it just makes it worse. So I think, you know, when we think about stress in the broader sense and money, then that, I think, has been really clearly illustrated. We're more stressed when we don't have it. And then sometimes we spend more to make ourselves feel better, then we become more stressed, and so on. And we take risks, and the risks make us stressed too. If we come more specifically next to eating and food and maybe body issues, so much of what we're hearing is the heating and eating argument. What a time to be alive, but really, I mean, it is shocking. So I'm going to come to George now to hear a bit more from you, from your experience, both professionally, as a student, as a peer, you know, what is happening and how is the money worry side of things affecting people with eating or body issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's multifaceted, and I doubt I'm even going to be able to cover all of it in this segment. But there's, I think one of the key links that works here is that we know that anxiety and stress links to disordered eating behaviors and disordered behaviors in a lot of ways. And actually, Vivi's idea of the cycle and talking about the use of money in this kind of cycle way reminds me of the kind of exercise dependency cycle, in that people will exercise in a way that makes them feel a bit better, but then suddenly they feel like they're dependent on that, and then they kind of get stuck in this cycle. And I think that, you know, as you say, the kind of heating versus eating argument kind of plays into that, in the sense that if in either way, if I'm to choose heating, for example, and then I'm cutting back on eating, that's obviously going to be taking up, I'm going to be engaging in disordered eating behaviors, being overly restrictive, and potentially then binge eating. And, you know, like that person you're talking about who has to somehow fiddle his way to get food because he's been so restrictive on himself that suddenly I need to binge eat, and again can bring out these disordered behaviors that could then likely lead to the attitudes and things that we see in eating disorders. But also, if you do choose eating and then you have a colder house, the idea of using exercise to try and stay warm, and even or going to the gym and spending all your time in the gym because it's heated, and you have a cheap membership as a student or something like that. And again, that's another money thing that someone has to potentially bring in. And I think it kind of comes out in multiple different ways. So those eating disorders, they can be used as a reason to kind of justify it, because you exercise to keep warm, you feel like that's helping you in certain ways. And if people question you, we all know that exercise is medicine idea and pushing that idea onto all of us, and we all think exercise is kind of inherently healthy. So if it's healthy and it's keeping you warm, even if someone thinks you might potentially have an issue, it's very easy to kind of defend against that, which can become a problem. And the same with food. Again, dieting and dieting behavior is often quite pushed as a very healthy narrative, and the idea of losing weight and these kind of ideas in general are pushed onto us overtly healthy in many different ways. And that's something that I had experience with myself, and especially with the muscularity side. I think people assume that if you go to the gym, if you eat in kind of clean foods, I don't like that term, but the idea of good and bad foods, and eating these foods which are often cheaper foods as well, so people can turn to like plain chicken and these plain foods that people will also highlight as clean. It can lead to this idea of feeling like you get this kind of moral worth from it as well, from people and from social media. And then with that as well as helping you save money, it creates this kind of perfect echo chamber for people to struggle with eating, exercise, and all these worries. And for people who already have these issues, people who already have disordered eating disorders, or negative relationships with their body, again, it's a perfect, again, I don't like the term excuse, but for me it would have been an excuse when I was struggling with eating disorder. If I can say I'm doing this because I need the money, or I'm doing this because I'm cold, it's again a perfect mask for, maybe not for a clinician, but at least for myself, to justify, okay, I can adopt those behaviors now because everyone else is doing it around me, so maybe I need to pick up back on them. And we were talking a little bit about that kind of poor mental health, and I was thinking about some recent research that I've looked at, and again, maybe a bit of a trigger warning here, going quite dark down, talking a bit about suicidality. And a lot of my research looks at men and men's issues with eating disorders and muscularity orientated stuff, and we know that 3 out of 4, or 75% of suicides in the UK come from men, and I imagine that's linked to money worries in some degree as well. I don't know if that's been seen at all in any of your work, Vivi, but we know that disordered eating and eating disorders link to suicidality, and we know that muscle dysmorphia does as well, in that the symptoms link very closely, and there seems to be a relationship there. So I think all these things coming together, this heating versus eating leading to these behaviors, and then them leading to this incredibly poor mental health, it's this really kind of dangerous cycle that people get stuck in.
So it feels like we need to be aware, as people who work with students, that money worries could make things worse for people who already have a problem, could potentially tip people who are sort of on the edge of having a problem but were kind of coping okay, but now suddenly they're having to make decisions about food that before were at least relatively straightforward, are now difficult decisions about food. And then I guess there are people who probably never had issues or were coping fine, but are genuinely deciding, you know, as you said, heating or eating, whether to stay warm or buy food, who are tipped into something completely new. So you've got all of these students and young people, well, all ages, of course, but all of these people suddenly potentially getting worse at a time when, unfortunately, the NHS is not coping terribly well in terms of not enough workforce, not enough resources. So universities are going to be trying to support a lot of these students through really quite difficult times. I think for me, we will come back to the suicidality thing, because I think that's an important sort of other topic to cover in just a sec. But Vivi, I'll just come back to you, because I think, you know, your Blackbullion survey in particular did have some specific feedback around eating issues, I think, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, food was obviously a huge factor, and thanks, George, because so much of that was I'd never thought about people exercising because they can't heat themselves. Like, it's so obvious when you say it, but that's a real insight for me. Thanks. I think what we need to bear in mind when it comes to food is we're talking about 10.1% inflation. Food inflation is running well over 20%. And so we need, and this is I'm hoping one of the solutions when we start to talk about some of the things that we can do is to really be honest about the differences in pricing. Inflation is not a good guide in the slightest for what's actually going on. But yeah, in terms of food and the heating eating cliche that I'm really hoping at some point will disappear from us. We found that our survey found 39% of students overall are not turning their heating on, 47% of women, 31% of men. So again, there's a very big gender difference that we're seeing in these factors. 34% are going hungry or eating one meal a day, 29% cutting back on having a balanced diet. So we can imagine that's a lot more carb type filling, because it's also cheaper to buy pasta than it is maybe to buy meat or to buy soy. The personal hygiene element for me was actually one of the most troubling. 16% cutting back on personal hygiene and health issues, 14% using a food bank, a little bit lower than the Student Minds survey that you mentioned, Dom, but still very much within the margin of error. And 8% of students are shoplifting, again, leaning more on average towards men. The personal hygiene issue for me is, of course, because I am a woman and I do understand what a lack of personal hygiene products can lead to, is a real concern for me, because it inevitably means that young women are not going to class and they're not, able to see friends because of the hygiene issues. So it's not just you don't have the product, but then there's all of the flow. And when my team kind of presented this for the first time we saw the numbers, my first thought was, this is like what happens in the Congo. Like, we're in the UK in the 21st century. We shouldn't be worrying about whether people are able to access the sanitary products that they need. So I think it's food and it's groceries in general. It's basically what's happening in the supermarket is the problem. And it is running at 20-25% inflation. I think eggs are at 30%. So we need to be more honest and conscious about what is happening with pricing, rather than saying it's 10% and therefore we should just increase all of maintenance loans by 10%, when actually students are facing an inflation more like 15 to 20. And Blackbullion, we are doing a piece of work where we are going to be producing regular student inflation numbers, specifically around students across the country, because inflation is meaningless in general. It's certainly meaningless to students. But the heating and eating, and just my last comment about it, I'm also very concerned from a practical issue that a lot of young people don't know how to cook. They're not comfortable cooking. They're not comfortable in the kitchen. It wasn't a skill that they learned growing up. And I think if you don't know how to cook, then you are locked down to takeaways. Takeaways are 5 times more expensive in terms of what you get for that money. And so from a practical thing, if anyone on the call is a parent, teach your kids to cook. Like, this is such an important, such an easy skill. much more healthy for you. It is much more social. So you can bring people together and, you know, make food. Students only need to know 4 meals: stir fries, stews, pasta bakes and soups. And if you know that, and a lot of that stuff can be made for a couple of quid for multiple people. But as a practical solution, this is one way of getting around it, is helping students to know how to cook, because you can still buy food cheap. It's just, you need to know how to then use it. And I think that's where a lot of the problems are coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm hoping we're gonna come back to some more, you know, elaborate on that a bit in a minute, actually, the sort of practical ideas. Yeah, I have to say, just to reiterate that for people who hadn't heard about the period poverty aspect of it, I was absolutely horrified to hear how big an issue that is now. I mean, one knows it happens sometimes, and that's why in our practice as GPs we have, you know, products in our loos, and I know obviously in schools that's now a big thing as well, but universities could also be making sure that they have the products easily available. But you know, it is just incredible the number of different ways that you know, obviously, I know it sounds so obvious, but money impacts people and therefore their mental health and well-being. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's not just a practical, you know, oh, we always think about paying the bills, but actually it's the everyday stuff, the impact. And just to come back to that risk of suicide, you're quite right, George, that suicide studies, I mean, the most recent one I've read about, obviously has just been released last week, was the National Confidential Inquiry into Suicide and Self-Harm from the University of Manchester, which is always a interesting, albeit difficult read, tells us yet again that, as they call it, economic adversity, financial difficulties, money worries, is a key risk factor for suicide. You're quite right, of course, that we know that most suicides do in fact occur in men, although, and I will bracket this, in students, it is female students are more at risk than non-student peers. So being a female student is a bit more risky in that sense, but it is still, of course, a greater number in male students. So I think, you know, money plays a big part in that. Suicidal thinking, behaviors, it's part of that bigger picture of feeling that you're failing, which a lot of students worry about a lot, you know, that they're not somehow living the dream, succeeding at everything, and how can they when things are so difficult? But of course, they're sold that narrative the whole way. It's very hard then when it doesn't quite work out. So I think, you know, it is important to remember the impact that money has at that level as well on mental health. So when we are supporting students, talking to them, and we're talking about all of their concerns, and of course we cover everything from accommodation, and we talk about their families and childhood issues and all of that, but money, it always seems like, oh, it's quite, oh, so all students have money worries. No, this is another level, and we need to be thinking about how it's interplaying with their mental health, and could play out in different ways, such as triggering eating or body issues or exercise addiction, you know, as well as the sort of the self-harmful behaviors, the risky behaviors that it can play into, and the suicidal thinking and behaviors sort of at the worst point. So I think, you know, hopefully that has sort of set the scene, raised the issue in perhaps a slightly different way from the way that we always think, oh, you know, money and students, well, we've known about that for centuries. Actually, you know, this is a different level. We need to think about this in a different way and take it really seriously. Obviously, that's what we're doing today. So I think hopefully that will lead us on to nicely the kind of, you know, what can we do to help? What can universities do to help? I've seen in the chat that, you know, people are, of course, providing things like the sanitary products, and I know loads of universities are doing fantastic work with providing microwaves and hot water and things like that. But I'd love to hear, I'm going to ask Vivi and George for some ideas. I've got a few thoughts to throw in, but you know, actually, I know loads of good stuff is happening already. This is maybe just to sort of do that cross-sharing of ideas. It's always quite useful when we have such expertise on the call, but also if you guys have stuff, pop it in the chat and we'll kind of, everybody can then see it and share those ideas as well, because I'd really like for people to go away thinking, well, okay, there are some serious issues here, perhaps I need to think about things, you know, slightly differently from how I was, about how it can tip people into problems or might exacerbate specific issues. But also, here are some things I could go back and talk to colleagues about, you know, setting up or starting or boosting in some way. So perhaps, Vivi, I'll come to you first. Let's hear about your favorite, you know, strategies, practical solutions, things that you've been hearing about that are helping that maybe other people haven't yet heard about. And you know, let's all sort of share some of that positive ideas.
Sure. And I just want to start by saying that we really do commend universities. I mean, Laura and I've just been having like a quick chat in the general chat. I think universities are doing a spectacularly important, but also they're just doing it with so much heart that it's really wonderful. And one of the reasons that I think this is so difficult is, and you said it right at the beginning, Dom, is that just the volume of support that is required is so very big that we kind of tend to go, well, government just needs to solve this, because we are talking about 2.5 million students. And if 89% are worried about money, you're simply talking about literally billions of pounds of support. And government is the only one that's really in place to do it. But government's not coming. And so the question is, what do we do? And so at the kind of micro level, if we can put it like that, I think a lot of the initiatives that are being done are to, you know, really could be spread across the country. We are talking about things as simple as sanitary products in the bathrooms. But we do know a lot of campuses are doing food cupboards, are doing food banks. A lot of universities we know are leaving the library open, for example, 24 hours a day and providing hot drinks in there, which again is a small issue, but it's also got a social component to it. And so having areas on campus that are freely available where you can access even just hot drinks can make an enormous difference getting people together. A lot of housing accommodation also have kind of stepped up their game, either by, you know, providing free food in certain days or, you know, breakfasts at certain time. So a lot of that work is being done, we know, kind of sporadically through the country, and I would encourage any campus that can afford to do it. There are a number of kind of one step up issues that we think are very important at a really granular level. There is a lot of funding that is available on campus, which is either very difficult to access or very difficult to discover. And so we are encouraging people to, you know, make it easy for students to find the pots of money that are available to them. And I don't just mean hardship. I mean, George is on scholarship or bursary, right? You're getting funding as well. There are a lot of pots of money. For anyone that's on the call, I just see Emma, who's one of our clients. We bought a scholarship company last year, and I've just hired somebody full-time who's building out our scholarship proposition. We want industry to get their feet wet and put their money where their mouth is, because companies have plenty of money and should be putting some of that towards students. And we're working very hard towards kind of building that up. But the third point, there you go, Trussell Trust as well, doing phenomenal work. Thanks, Lorraine. The last thing that I'll say, I'll pass over to George as well, is to, on the advice and guidance side, is to be as open and transparent as possible with students. Protecting them from the truth is not helping them. We've got a new cohort of students coming in September. Those students are coming into a world in which the financial crisis is going to be real. This thing will be over in the next 18 months, but it won't be in the next 6. Be honest with them about what it costs to live on campus. Like, how much is toilet paper going to cost you, and how much is rent going to cost you, and how much should you expect to spend on food, and what are the facilities available? There are far too many students landing on campus already in debt with no idea how much university is going to cost them. We have got to increase the level of knowledge of these young people and of their parents and guardians. And a quick plug for the various books that Trigger has published incredibly helpfully. But give these parents the tools so that they can then have the conversations with their young person about familial support, about where to go if they need help, about budgeting, about cooking, and about what it's going to cost on campus. So those would kind of be my super headlines. We obviously have a lot of micro ideas, but we need to think short term, as in how do we get people through the next term, but also how do we get this new batch of students in safely and securely. But I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any specific. But George, I'll hand over to you, because I can talk all day, as you all know. So I'm going to shut up and hand over to George.
Thanks, Vivi. And yeah, it's really nice to hear that, you know, you guys are doing these things, and I do see at least in my uni, the information about finances and things, and people talking about bursaries and things. So it is nice to see it. I'm going to say up front, I'm no finance expert, so I definitely can't give much advice in that range, but I can come from my lived experience and my work in mental healthy stuff and research. So I've basically come up with some free/cheap things that people can do in organizations, or you can do personally. I think one thing that's helped me a lot, and something that people can push for students, or if you're a student yourself listening to this, or someone who's struggling, and working on mindfulness is something that's helped me a lot, and being aware of my own emotions and learning around those kind of things through journaling, through meditation. Again, these are things that are very free for us all, and things that we can work on a lot. And if you do work in an organization or a uni, making groups where people can do that together. Again, you can just set up a time and a place where people can come together and learn about those kind of things, or engage in them themselves. Some students may already do it, and there's a lot of students, I imagine, who are willing to help lead those kind of sessions, or, you know, work with other students to work on those kind of things. On top of that, education about eating disorders and about unhealthy relationships with exercise. And there's information on plenty of websites, but a classic one is BEAT, which is BEAT, which is an eating disorder charity. You can find information on there. As regards unhealthy relationships with exercise, I did some work with Mind recently, and we developed some guidance for different sectors about that. So you can find that on the Mind website. And we know that mental health literacy, so basically understanding mental health, is something that tends to improve mental health, or improve people's ability to deal with mental health issues. So improving that education helps a lot. And I also think that links to something called alexithymia, which is basically this learned inability to explain or identify your emotions, which is something we see a lot in men and boys, but in anyone, in any gender. But I think, again, education around that can help with people understanding their emotions, and also potentially help with that help-seeking behavior and actually reaching out for help, especially when, Vivi, right at the start, you were talking about how because of money worries, people don't seek help because they're worried about the other person's money as well. And the thing that scared me was how that kind of behavior could be repeated then for mental health issues or for other things. And, you know, I don't want to ask them about this, so I probably shouldn't ask them about this as well. And again, educating people about the importance of talking about things is really, will definitely have a benefit. Again, advice I can give for people who are struggling themselves, at least from my personal experiences, working on your community, especially online. We know social media has a big impact on these things, and I think social media, one of social media's big issues is the comparison idea, and I think money worries is something that tends to lend itself to comparisons as well, of people thinking, oh, that person has more money, or that person's spending money on these things. So, you know, if you are following people on social media that give you that stress or give you those worries, trying to cut them out, muting them, unfollowing them, blocking them, etc., is a big thing you can do. And then my final thing is something that helped me a lot with my counsellor originally, and something that I push for everyone, is the idea of building your pyramid, which is my life was built on a pillar originally, where my body and my exercise and food was everything that the rest of my self-worth was built on. And one of the things I worked on was creating a pyramid where I actually have these multiple parts of me that I love and I respect, and I now lean on for the rest of my life. So if one of them goes missing, for example, if I am struggling with my body image or whatever, I actually have all these other aspects that are still holding me up. And that's something I can really stress, is looking at different things that you can love about yourself. And I'll shut up there.
Oh, I love that, George. That's really nice. I like that analogy. That's great. Thank you. Those are some really positive and useful things that people can try. Just to recap before I say a little bit, if you've got questions, do pop them in the chat, because we'll come to those in a minute. Because, you know, we've obviously been talking and sometimes you're so swept up in it. But if there's that burning question you've been wanting to just check or ask other people, you know, is anyone doing this? Has anyone tried that? You know, obviously now is your moment. I know that for me, one of the things that I try to focus on wherever I'm trying to give positive ideas, I think it's really helpful to look at the building community aspect, which I think you've both touched on. it is so important not to suddenly isolate yourself away, feel like you can't see your friends, can't spend money. There are things that people can do, and maybe universities can help and encourage some of these, as you know, I know they're doing it already, but it's maybe just that sort of reiteration of stuff they can do together, but that also addresses the fact that it doesn't have to cost a lot of money. I did a bit of a sort of just a brainstorm of myself of like what might be ideas, and I don't doubt for a minute that some of this is happening already. But one of my things is I'm a big fan of wonky veg. So that you didn't think you'd hear that today, but yeah, wonky veg is something, you know, the students can Google it for a start, but loads of places do this whole thing now about the less perfect vegetable. And, you know, we're all perfect in our own way, but they are cheaper. They are often the seasonal ones. They're healthy, of course, and you're supporting your local farmers and all of that. So I think there's something to do. Maybe there could be a social media campaign around show us your wonky veg recipes. You know, it would allow those who are vegetarian or vegan to participate. It does mean that even if you have eating issues or body issues, it can still feel like it's a healthy, positive thing you're doing for yourself, nourishing yourself, but you make it like a funny twist. You know, I'm just sort of maybe leave that with you and your social media teams to think about how you do something, but I'm hoping that oh, did my internet cut out? Did you hear me say wonky veg? Because that's the main thing. Do something around that, because I do think being creative is a positive thing as well, for people to think, you know, they can still be innovative and creative and have ideas and thoughts. They don't just sort of, you know, try not to let them just sit and feel anxious and stressed and down alone, you know. And then for me, there's some positive stuff around, you know, if they're living in different houses or different flats. So within a flat, there are things like cooking together, obviously, but what about pressure cooker cooking? That is something that maybe people could buy together, but is also a different way to cook that is in fact uses less energy and is cheaper, but gives you different options. So that's something they can do together. I love American suppers. I don't know what, there's probably like a potluck supper is another way of saying it, you know, where you go to your friends, but you all bring something different. I know people will be doing some of this, but it's just reminding the students they may not have come across this so much in their lives. We're all a bit older and we've seen life a bit. And we used to do that thing of going from flat to flat or house to house with like, you'd have your starter at one and then a main course at another, you know, and again, you're sharing the cost, but it's communal. So I just think, let's see if we can encourage them, you know, using the food sharing apps to get free, or, you know, they can get low cost foods, get them to be communal together. I think my big thing here is doing stuff together, still being creative, you know, getting them to share their ideas on social media, sharing recipes. All of those sorts of things are really helpful. And, you know, websites like, I'm sure you've probably put it in there as well, but Money Saving Expert has ideas around the cheap food deals. And not to forget Money and Mental Health as a website. Money and Mental Health is a good website too. So yeah, I think, you know, I've sort of shared some ideas there as well that hopefully, you know, sort of emphasize that community aspect, because for me, the worry is that when people get down, they self-isolate, they don't want to be bad company to other people. So, you know, they think, oh, I'll just stay on my own and I'll, you know, order a pizza on Klarna, and it will just, you know, it's just really emphasizes that negativity. And as much as we can, we try and get them out and together and doing stuff and getting to know each other. I think that. So, okay, I'm gonna stop chatting at you and I'm gonna see if we can go back. I'll go back through the chat a little bit just to see if we've got any questions, but I'm loving some of these, yeah, food safaris, that's another way to, yes, well, I couldn't remember the name, but there's some brilliant apps. So Too Good To Go, Oh, great. That's for sort of leftover foods. Obviously, I love oleo. I put a lot of stuff myself on there, and I love it. I also like it in the autumn. This is an autumn thing. We have an apple tree in our garden, way too many apples. So I ask the students to come over and pick all the apples and take what they can. I imagine it isn't all apple crumble. I suspect there's some cider brewed, but that's all fine. And, you know, and I think it's, you know, if there's any ways to encourage sort of that sort of food sharing, that's really good. Just looking back, I can't see many questions as such. So I'll go back down to see if there's more questions coming in, but I am. Yeah, Vivi, you're welcome to apples anytime. So any other thoughts or questions? Because I've seen loads of brilliant sort of stuff about allotments, fruit and veg, helping themselves to obviously the teas and the coffees. I'm really glad people have shared some brilliant ideas and, you know, concepts and ways that they're helping. There's stuff about food boxes, sanitary products. Obviously, I'm just going back a bit because obviously I've been chatting and haven't had a campus cupboard. Is that like a, you know, free dry goods kind of thing? That sounds like a useful thing. Is that something, I mean, maybe the staff, I mean, I know staff will be under some pressure as well, but maybe staff, if they've got a spare tin of soup, could stick it in the campus cupboard. I don't know. Or do we not want to ask staff to do that? I'm not asking that you have to. I'm just saying it is a way to do it, I suppose. Here we have a question. Okay, so I'm going to come to Vivi with this one. This is about how much has the abolishment of the maintenance grant affected students? So coming to you, Vivi.
A lot, but I guess it means in what sense? The biggest problem that government is not understanding, and I'm kind of using that loosely because I think there's any number of things the government are not understanding, but that's a separate webinar. Is that students are not worried about their student loan, they're worried about putting food on the table. So it is the maintenance issue that is the biggest issue. Not having, whether it's a grant or a loan, I also think is less of a factor than the absolute, I nearly said absolute quantum, leaning back into my banking days, the absolute amount of money. So whether it's a grant or a loan, students are actually not worried so much about the repayments. So if there was an increase in maintenance loans, it would actually have the same impact as maintenance grants at this moment for the students that we are speaking with, who simply want to see more money landing in their account every single month. They're not so worried about the repayments later. So it's probably an easier sell at a policy level to increase the loan structure than it is to increase the grants, for all of the reasons that we all understand with budgets. But what we need to do is students need more money in their pocket at the start of every term.
Thank you. And I can see that someone, Dan, I think, has asked about where all these amazing ideas are being shared. And I gather Blackbullion shares some of them. And I think NASMA, the National Association of Student Money Advisors, rather, also shares them. And then we have a question about how detrimental to student mental health do the panelists believe the housing crisis is, and what can be done to tackle it? Well, we can't fix it all today, but I do think, yes, the housing crisis, when I see the queues of students queuing to get the first rentals that come, clearly, I absolutely agree. It's creating stress and worry and uncertainty. I will again come to Vivi. I'll ask George as well in a second for any thoughts on that, again, as a student, but also somebody who works with students. So Vivi, thoughts about the housing crisis impact?
Huge. We've got a number of concurrent problems when it comes to housing. The first is we have an actual housing shortage in any number of university towns across the country. There actually simply is not enough stock. And what that means is that prices can be pushed up because it's pure supply and demand. So if there's too many people who need it, you can jack up your prices. So we have a shortage of stock, we have increased prices, and we have increased energy prices, which we haven't really touched on, but we all know is a problem. And hopefully, you know, although the Chancellor is going to announce that they're holding for another 3 months, that doesn't help students at all. Students are not beneficiaries of the government's energy policy. So housing, food, and energy are the three number one problems that are facing students, and that's being driven by a lack of stock, which is in a lot of university towns. So it is a real problem. If we were going to, by the way, protest anything, energy prices should be the one, because there's actually no economically good reason for energy to be as expensive as it is in this country at the moment. That petition I would sign in a heartbeat.
That is one to start, Vivi, one to start. There you
absolutely.
go.
I'm sure if I'm coming to your house to get some apples.
Oh yeah, do that and we'll write it together. Thank you. And George, any sort of final thoughts about what we've been talking about, the housing crisis, anything like that before I just sort of, I'll finish up in a sec. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, all I can really say about the housing crisis, I mean, right now, again, for me, I feel kind of fortunate that I live with my partner as well, who brings in her wage, so I'm not too in much of a problem. But I know that even when I was doing my undergrad, which was years before all this was happening, there was definitely a fear around trying to get enough housing. So I can't even imagine if that's reduced now. In my second year, we couldn't get anything for a long time, and we had to live in this horrendous house that was basically built on a slant. And that definitely affected my mental health, just in the conditions that we lived in for the price that we were paying. That was kind of disheartening and stressful in many different ways. And then again, we also tended to be really cold because we couldn't afford the heating on that house, because they booked the price up because they knew we were desperate. And there are these kind of issues that come into play. So I imagine it's only worse now, which again is really scary.
No, thank you, George. Those are really difficult ideas. So I'm going to come to Vivi. One final word from Vivi then, please share with us something.
I've got positive news that I wanted to end on, and if anyone wants to get in touch about anything we've discussed, or the app that we're launching, which is about not running out of money for students, that's what we're building it for, please do get in touch. But just a positive thing to end on. Although it's all looking very doom and gloom at the moment for students, our report is showing quite unequivocally that students are still very optimistic about the future. So I just want to end on an optimism scale. So while at university and while they're studying, 43% of students are pessimistic and 28% are optimistic. But 5 years after graduating, when they look at their life forward 5 years, 60% of them are optimistic and only 17% are pessimistic. So when we ask students to think about life a year, 3 years, 5 years beyond their education, they still see education very positively. They see their lives very positively. It's this short-term period which is stressing them out, but they are long-term very optimistic. And every report we're seeing about Gen Z, and I hate to use that expression, is that they are very resilient. They are very optimistic. They do believe that life is going to be great. We just have to help them to navigate this period now. And I think that that's positive.
Thank you. That's fantastic. So I'm going to thank our two panelists. I'm going to remind you that our books, the Student Wellbeing series, are available from Trigger, which covers all sorts of different topics, supporting students, anxiety, depression, money, risk, all sorts of things. Do have a look at those. Oh, that's me telling me myself that I've done that I've got to the end of the webinar. Well done, me. And I just want to say thank you so much to Vivi and to George for some brilliant ideas, some background, for joining us. And I hope that all of those ideas have also sparked you to go off and continue to do the amazing work you do to support students. So thank you, everyone. And, do all stay in touch or have a look at the TriggerHub website for more information. We can do this together. We'll support our students. Thank you, everybody. Bye. Bye.